You know, he was always better than you, Vanessa said over the video call, her tone light, almost teasing, and I froze mid-step in the kitchen, hand gripping the edge of the counter like it might steady me. But all it did was remind me of how unsteady everything felt inside. I'm Ethan Brooks, 37, CEO of a small but growing tech startup in Austin, Texas, and for the past 10 minutes, my world had been quietly crumbling behind her casual words. The screen glowed with her familiar grin, the one she wears when she's enjoying a story at a party. Except this story wasn't for anyone else. It was for me, and she didn't seem to notice the weight behind my silence. The room around me was dim, the blinds drawn to keep the late afternoon sun from burning into my eyes. Yet even in the soft light, every detail of our apartment felt sharper than usual. The small dent in the corner of the counter, the faded stain on the rug from months ago, the hum of the fridge that never used to bother me, but now sounded like a metronome counting down the seconds of my patience. I lowered myself onto the bar stool, feeling the wood cool beneath me, trying to anchor myself while her words echoed in my head, ricocheting between disbelief and quiet rage. I remembered the first time we met at that tech conference in downtown Austin, her handing me a latte with a bright smile that made the day feel lighter, the conversations that stretched long into the evening as we talked about everything from coding to coffee beans, thinking that maybe, just maybe, I had found someone who could understand the life I was building. And now, sitting in the same apartment we had moved into together 2 years ago, I realized how far apart our worlds had quietly drifted, the spaces between us filled with unspoken tensions and little resentments that had grown into invisible walls. Vanessa's laughter from the call felt almost cruel, the way it carried across the distance between us and reminded me that she didn't see me as a partner in this moment, just as a listener for her story, a witness to her pride in someone else. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool air move in and out, letting each exhale carry a fraction of the tension out of my chest. I studied the background behind her on the screen. A sleek apartment in another part of the city, sunlight spilling across hardwood floors, a picture of her and a group of friends from a recent party, all of them smiling and unaware of the storm quietly gathering on my side of the call. The contrast between our spaces, the polished world she inhabited and the apartment we shared, made me feel smaller, yet sharper, like a blade honing itself in silence. I reminded myself of the calm I had learned to cultivate in moments like these, the controlled edge beneath a quiet surface, and how it had served me in boardrooms and client meetings when the stakes were high and emotions could betray strategy. I let my fingers drum lightly on the countertop, listening to the rhythm, letting it ground me as I planned my next step, not reacting to the bait, not letting the venom of comparison and pride dictate my actions. Instead, I collected the fragments of information I already had, her recent mentions of ex-boyfriends, the subtle boasts she had made in passing to friends, the patterns in her social media posts that hinted at a story she wanted to tell without ever acknowledging the part of me that existed in that story. The more I observed, the more I realized that this wasn't a random slip, but a thread I could follow, one that would lead me to the truth of her intentions, and I decided then that I wouldn't let the moment pass without response. Not a reaction of anger, but a controlled, deliberate reveal, one that would preserve my dignity while exposing the reality beneath the surface. The air in the apartment felt heavier now, each second stretching longer as I weighed my options. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of traffic outside marking the passage of time, reminding me that the opportunity to act with precision is fleeting and that hesitation could mean losing the advantage. I adjusted my chair slightly, straightened my back, and let my gaze settle on the muted TV across the room, the soft glow reflecting a sense of patience I was determined to maintain, preparing myself for the moment when I would step from observation to action, turning her boast into the starting point of a revelation she never saw coming. And in that controlled quiet, I felt the first stirrings of the plan that would ultimately expose the truth while leaving my own integrity intact. The next morning, the sunlight poured through the blinds in a thin, golden stream, cutting across the kitchen floor where Ethan Brooks sat at the table, fingers loosely clasped, eyes fixed on the laptop open in front of him. The previous night had been a quiet storm in his mind, each word Vanessa had spoken looping endlessly. But now, with the day beginning around him, The reality settled like dust in a still room. He scanned the emails, the subtle mentions of meetings with former colleagues, the offhand references to dinners that never included him, and he noted the patterns that had been building silently over months. Ethan's apartment was calm, orderly, almost unnaturally so, and it gave him space to think, to measure the distance between perception and reality. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the air, and let the warmth settle in his hands as he considered the threads of evidence he had gathered, the quiet indicators of pride, ambition, and a subtle disregard that Vanessa had displayed repeatedly without realizing the watchful eye he had kept. Each note, each small boasting comment, added to the mosaic of understanding, and he traced the steps in his mind, each action deliberate, each observation contributing to the map of her confidence and his own strategic patience. He remembered how he had learned, over years of business negotiations and late nights at the office, to listen not only to words but to the spaces between them, the pauses, the inflections, the tiny tells that reveal far more than the sentence itself. Ethan sipped the coffee slowly, letting the bitterness ground him, and he considered the arc of their relationship, from the initial days when trust had been easy, when laughter had been effortless, to this present moment where awareness of subtle manipulations required calm scrutiny. He thought about the importance of timing, of precision, and how every decision made in the first flush of emotion could close doors he did not intend to shut. As he worked through the details, the morning sun shifted across the room, illuminating the edge of a notebook where Vanessa had meticulously recorded schedules, social engagements, and reminders, all innocent at first glance. But to Ethan, now a roadmap to the intentions she had not thought to hide. He straightened his back, allowing the rhythm of controlled breathing to steady him, and he visualized the moment when he would move from observation to measured revelation, exposing not anger but clarity, not shame but understanding, and he allowed a faint smile to cross his face, the kind of smile that signifies quiet confidence, the preparation of a plan that would demonstrate insight, patience, and the hidden depth of his awareness. Ethan glanced around the apartment, noting the ordinary objects, the framed photos, the coffee maker, the soft hum of the refrigerator, and he realized that in their ordinariness, he could find a stage for the unfolding truth, a place where every subtle action would speak louder than confrontation. He adjusted the chair beneath him, fingers tapping lightly on the wood, a metronome for his thoughts, marking each second as he synchronized strategy with observation, knowing that the culmination of his patience would arrive not through haste, but through precision, and that by allowing the day to progress while he maintained control, he would transform the ordinary rhythm of their shared environment into the framework for clarity, for revelation, and for the quiet assertion of dignity that would define the unfolding events in a way that left no room for misunderstanding or misjudgment. By mid-morning, the sunlight had shifted, casting long stripes across the wooden floor of Ethan Brooks' apartment, and he remained seated at the table, still observing, still measuring every detail. Vanessa had stepped away from her call, leaving a faint echo of her laughter lingering in the quiet space, and Ethan allowed himself a single exhale, steady and deliberate, feeling the tension that had built over months ease slightly, while the plan he had been crafting began to crystallize in his mind. Each email, each message, each social media post he had tracked provided more than just evidence. They revealed patterns of behavior, the subtle ways she had been presenting herself, emphasizing certain connections and interactions to elevate the stories of others while diminishing the acknowledgement of his presence and contributions. He traced these interactions carefully, noting times, dates, the order of events, and the audiences involved, as if piecing together a puzzle that demanded precision and patience, understanding that the impact would be greatest when each element aligned in sequence. Ethan rose slowly from the chair, stretching his back, the faint ache from hours of sitting a reminder of the need for movement and clarity, and he walked to the window, gazing at the city below, the streets humming with life as people moved about their ordinary routines, unaware of the careful orchestration of observation taking place above them. He returned to the table, opened a drawer, and retrieved a small notebook, its pages filled with neat, precise entries, tracking Vanessa's actions alongside his own observations, and he added the final notes from the morning, connecting details that, when viewed together, formed a coherent narrative of intent, not accusation, but understanding. The apartment, filled with the warm mid-morning light, seemed to support him in this process. Every object around him, from the coffee cup still half full, to the framed photograph of a previous family vacation, to the soft ticking of the wall clock, serving as markers of time, anchors to reality as he prepared for the next step. Ethan's thoughts were steady, deliberate, tracing the arc of their interactions, imagining the timing, the pacing, the sequence that would allow him to reveal the truth with clarity and precision, ensuring that the focus would remain on facts, on the careful demonstration of observation and insight rather than emotion alone. He considered the room as a stage, each object, each detail a prop that could underscore the subtlety of his revelations, and he rehearsed the sequence in his mind, visualizing how he would guide the conversation, how he would present the connections, the consistencies, the implications, so that the truth became undeniable not through confrontation, but through the careful illumination of reality. The air was still, the faint hum of the city below a distant rhythm, and Ethan allowed the quiet to reinforce his focus, each breath measured, each thought deliberate, preparing him to step from analysis into action, knowing that the preparation he had taken, the observation he had conducted, and the patience he had cultivated would culminate in a moment of clarity where the narrative of her actions could be laid bare without embellishment, without distortion, and with the assurance that the truth, once presented, would stand on its own, leaving no room for misinterpretation or doubt. Vanessa came home at a little after 6 that evening, carrying the scent of expensive perfume, iced coffee, and the kind of confidence that fills a room before a person says a word. Ethan heard her keys before he saw her, the sharp metallic scrape at the lock, the quick push of the door, the familiar sound of her heels crossing the entryway tile. He closed his laptop halfway, not enough to look secretive, just enough to make the screen go dark, and watched her reflection appear in the window above the kitchen sink. She was smiling at her phone, thumb moving fast, lips curved with private amusement, and for a moment, the apartment felt like two separate homes sharing the same walls. One belonged to the woman laughing at something he was not meant to hear. The other belonged to the man who had finally started listening closely enough to understand what silence had been hiding. She dropped her handbag onto the chair, kicked off her heels near the hallway, and said, "Long day," without looking up. Ethan nodded, his face calm, his voice even. "Same here." That was all. 2 words. Safe words. Married words. The kind people use when the real conversation is too heavy to lift. Vanessa moved through the kitchen like she owned every inch of it, opening the refrigerator, pulling out a bottle of sparkling water, checking her reflection in the microwave door. The small diamond on her finger flashed under the light as she twisted the cap, and Ethan remembered the night he bought it, 3 months before his company landed its first real investor, when the cost had scared him but the meaning had mattered more. Back then, he had believed a ring could promise direction. Now he knew a ring could also sit on a hand that pointed somewhere else. She leaned against the counter and finally looked at him. "You have been quiet today." He could hear the test inside the sentence. Not concern, not warmth. A test. Ethan gave her a tired half-smile and said, "Just thinking." Vanessa studied him for half a second, then seemed to decide he was harmless enough to ignore. She lifted her phone again. The glow softened her face, made her look younger, almost like the woman he used to meet for tacos on South Congress when neither of them had much money and every shared meal felt like a plan for the future. Then her smile widened, and the past disappeared. "You remember Daniel, right?" she asked, too casually. Ethan felt the name land between them like a glass set too hard on a table. Daniel Price. The ex-boyfriend with the perfect jawline, the commercial real estate contacts, the lake house outside Dallas, and the permanent place in Vanessa's stories whenever she wanted Ethan to feel like a smaller version of a man. Ethan did not move. "I remember him." Vanessa laughed softly, eyes still on her phone. "He just closed another deal. Something huge in Phoenix. I swear, he always knew how to move fast when an opportunity showed up." There it was again. Not a compliment spoken into empty air, but a comparison with a blade hidden under the napkin. Ethan felt the old instinct rise in him, the need to defend himself, to remind her of the payroll he met every 2 weeks, The 12-hour days, the investors who now returned his calls, the quiet pressure of building something from code, debt, and stubborn faith. But he did not take the bait. He reached for his coffee mug, though it had gone cold hours ago, and wrapped his hand around it anyway. Vanessa kept talking, her voice light, almost entertained by her own memory. She said Daniel had always been decisive. Daniel had always understood status. Daniel had never been afraid to spend money to look successful before success arrived. Ethan listened to every word, and with each one, something inside him became less wounded and more clear. Because pain is loud at first. Then, if you refuse to feed it, pain becomes information. He watched her posture, the tilt of her chin, the easy confidence of someone who believed the room still belonged to her. She had no idea that the pattern she thought was harmless had already been mapped, dated, and understood. She had no idea that Ethan had seen enough to know Daniel was not just a memory she admired, but a mirror she used to measure him unfairly in front of others. And she had no idea that by bringing his name into their kitchen again, she had just handed Ethan the missing piece he needed. He set the mug down gently, making no sound against the counter, and said, "Sounds impressive." Vanessa looked up, expecting bitterness, maybe jealousy, maybe the small satisfaction of seeing him flinch. Instead, she found nothing but calm. That unsettled her. He could see it in the tiny pause before she smiled again. "It is impressive," she said. "Some people just know how to win." Ethan nodded once, slowly, and let the silence stretch just long enough for the air to change. Outside, traffic hissed along the wet street from an evening drizzle, tires whispering over pavement, city lights beginning to glow against the windows. Inside, the apartment held its breath. Ethan thought of the notebook in the drawer, the screenshots saved in 3 places, the dates aligned like stepping stones across dark water. Then he looked at his wife, not with anger, not with pleading, but with the steady patience of a man who had stopped asking to be valued by someone committed to misunderstanding him. "You are right," he said quietly. "Some people do know how to win." Vanessa smiled like she had won the exchange. Ethan smiled back like he already knew the final score. The evening settled in with the soft hum of streetlights glowing through the blinds, and Ethan Brooks leaned back in his chair, the quiet weight of observation still settling over him like a familiar blanket. Vanessa had moved to the living room, phone in hand, her laughter drifting faintly from the other side of the apartment, a soundtrack of casual confidence that had become second nature to her. Ethan watched, noting how she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, how the small tilt of her head as she read a message betrayed an almost imperceptible pride, the kind people carry when they think themselves cleverer than anyone in the room. He sipped his now lukewarm coffee, letting the taste anchor him in the reality that the moment to act required patience, precision, and calm, not hasty reaction. In the corner, the notebook lay open, its pages carefully filled with dates, observations, and screenshots, all aligned to form a clear, undeniable picture of patterns, behavior, and intention. Ethan ran a finger along the edge of the table, feeling the smooth grain of the wood, and imagined the sequence of events that would unfold if he moved at the right moment. If he allowed the calm he had cultivated to guide each word, each gesture, each subtle reveal. Vanessa laughed again, a soft, unguarded sound, and Ethan realized that in her ease, she had revealed more than she intended. Her casual references, the pride in recounting Daniel Price's accomplishments, the way she lingered on certain details, all spoke louder than words meant to conceal. Ethan felt a quiet satisfaction, the sort that comes from understanding fully, from seeing the architecture of someone else's actions with clarity that they themselves cannot perceive. He straightened his chair slightly, aligning himself with the rhythm of the apartment, the faint ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft glow of city lights painting the walls. Every detail was a cue, every pause a marker, every inflection a map, and Ethan traced them all in his mind, knowing that when he chose to act, the impact would be as precise as the observation that had led him there. He rehearsed in silence, letting the narrative play out, not in anger but in controlled revelation, imagining Vanessa's face when the pattern became apparent, when the subtle manipulation, the casual boasts, and the unwitting comparisons all lined up into a story she could no longer control. The apartment seemed to hold its breath, as if in anticipation, every object, every light, every sound amplifying the potential of the forthcoming moment. Ethan felt the calm settle deeper, a quiet readiness that allowed him to move from passive observation to deliberate revelation, to speak and act with measured authority, and he allowed the thought to anchor him further. The truth does not need flourish or confrontation. It only needs to be seen clearly, and when it is, it stands untouchable. Vanessa adjusted herself on the couch, tilting the phone slightly as she checked a message, and Ethan noted the faint reflection in the window, the soft crease of her brow that hinted at attention paid, not to him, but to the world she had constructed in which she was always a step ahead. Yet Ethan was not merely a witness anymore. He was prepared, patient, and positioned, ready to turn observation into clarity, patience into revelation, and quiet endurance into the moment when understanding itself would speak louder than any accusation could. And in that stillness, he knew the steps he had laid out, the careful attention to detail, the deliberate calm, would guide the evening toward the precise point where all patterns would be made visible, undeniable, and complete. By 8:15, the apartment had settled into that strange evening quiet that comes after dinner but before sleep, when every small sound feels clearer than it should. The dishwasher hummed behind Ethan, rinsing plates they had barely spoken over, and Vanessa sat curled on the couch with one leg tucked beneath her, scrolling through her phone like the whole night belonged to her. Ethan stood at the kitchen sink, drying his hands with a gray towel, watching the faint reflection of her face in the dark window. She smiled twice at the screen. The second smile lasted too long. He did not ask who it was. He did not need to. There are questions a man asks because he wants answers, and there are questions he stops asking because the pattern has already answered for him. He folded the towel neatly and placed it beside the sink, then walked to the table where his laptop waited half open. Vanessa looked up only when she heard the chair scrape softly against the floor. "Working again?" she asked, not annoyed exactly, just amused, like his ambition was a hobby she had tolerated too long. Ethan opened the screen and let the blue light settle across his face. "Just checking something." She made a small sound in her throat and looked back down at her phone. That sound said plenty. It said she had already decided who he was. The safe one. The predictable one. The man who would absorb the little cuts and call it marriage because he still believed endurance proved love. Ethan used to be that man. He used to hear her mention Daniel Price and feel the heat climb up his neck, used to wonder what he lacked, used to measure himself against a ghost wearing a better suit. But the last 24 hours had changed something. Not loudly, not dramatically, more like a door closing softly in an empty house. He opened a folder on his laptop, then another, moving with the calm precision of a man reviewing quarterly numbers before a board meeting. Inside were the pieces Vanessa had scattered without realizing it. A screenshot from a charity luncheon where she captioned Daniel as the only man in the room who understood real ambition. A private group chat forwarded by a mutual friend where she joked that Ethan was still learning how winners think. A calendar invite for coffee with Daniel listed as networking, even though the place was 40 minutes across town and nowhere near her office. None of it was scandalous by itself. That was the trick. One drop of water is nothing. 100 drops can stain the ceiling until everyone finally looks up. Ethan copied the files into a clean folder and labeled it with the date, not out of revenge, but out of discipline. Facts deserved order. Pain deserved boundaries. He heard Vanessa laugh softly from the couch and say, "That is exactly what I told him." Ethan's fingers stopped above the keyboard. She had not meant to say it loud enough for him to hear, but carelessness grows when someone feels untouchable. He looked at the dark window again and saw himself reflected there. 37 years old, tired eyes, buttoned-down shirt wrinkled at the sleeves, face calm enough to fool a stranger. Behind that calm sat years of work she had treated like background noise. 2 a.m., investor calls. Payroll weeks when he paid his team before paying himself. Flights to Denver, Dallas, and San Francisco with a backpack full of pitch decks and hope. Vanessa had seen the exhaustion, but not the cost. She had enjoyed the stability, but mocked the process that built it. Ethan closed the folder and opened one more document, the one she did not know existed. It was a signed partnership memo from 3 weeks earlier, confirming that his company had secured a major contract with a national retail chain, the kind of deal that would put his name in rooms Daniel Price only pretended to own. He had not announced it yet because the press release was scheduled for Friday morning. Vanessa had spent weeks praising another man for knowing how to win, while the man sitting 10 feet away had already won quietly. Ethan stared at the document for a long moment, and something inside him settled. Not pride, not even satisfaction, just clarity. The truth did not need him to shout. It had a date, a signature, and a company letterhead. Vanessa looked over the couch and said, "You are being weird tonight." Ethan closed the laptop gently. "No," he said, standing with the same quiet calm that made boardrooms listen. "I'm just done pretending I do not notice things." Her smile faded by 1 inch, just enough for him to see the first crack. Vanessa froze for a heartbeat, the faintest pause betraying the confidence she had worn like armor all evening. Ethan's eyes remained steady, observing, cataloging every flicker of emotion that passed across her face, the tilt of her jaw, the brief narrowing of her green eyes, the subtle shift in posture that spoke louder than any words could. He walked toward the couch, slow and deliberate, letting the floorboards beneath his feet creak just enough to mark his presence without rushing the moment. The soft glow of the streetlights outside filtered through the blinds, painting stripes across the carpet, adding a quiet rhythm to the space that matched the pulse of anticipation inside him. He set the laptop down carefully on the coffee table, opening it to the folder that held the evidence he had assembled, the collection of dates, messages, and references that painted a precise, unbroken line through months of interactions Vanessa had thought she had hidden, each detail curated with deliberate care. Vanessa shifted slightly, a faint frown forming, sensing that something had changed, that the weight of quiet observation had become tangible, that Ethan was no longer simply present but ready to speak with authority, grounded in fact. Ethan took a deep breath, letting it settle through his chest, and began to recount the sequence of events without accusation, without emphasis, letting the facts themselves illustrate the pattern she had created, the subtle boasts, the careful comparisons, the casual elevations of another man at his expense. He spoke with measured cadence, each sentence precise, allowing space for the implications to land naturally, each pause a deliberate beat that highlighted understanding rather than anger. Vanessa's lips parted slightly as she listened, realizing for the first time that the pattern she had relied upon to assert superiority was now fully visible, each link in the chain laid bare before her, undeniable, unembellished. Ethan continued, maintaining a calm, even tone, guiding the narrative with the kind of quiet authority that left no room for interruption, no opportunity for deflection, and yet carried an unmistakable weight, the kind that only comes from patience, preparation, and disciplined observation. He illustrated the timeline, noting interactions she had believed inconsequential, connecting them to the broader picture without ever raising his voice, without dramatizing, allowing the sequence itself to serve as proof. Vanessa shifted on the couch again, a slight slump in her posture betraying the first cracks in the confidence she had maintained so firmly, the realization dawning that her casual boasts, her prideful remarks, and her selective stories had been meticulously documented, understood, and prepared for this precise moment. Ethan closed the laptop gently, the sound deliberate, signaling the completion of his presentation, and met her gaze, unwavering, calm, and composed, letting the silence stretch just long enough for comprehension to settle, for the truth to resonate, for Vanessa to recognize that the subtle elevation of another had been observed, measured, and contextualized, and that the quiet patience of a man who had endured, watched, and understood fully now framed the reality of the room with undeniable clarity. The apartment itself seemed to hold its breath, every shadow and shaft of light emphasizing the weight of observation transformed into revelation, and Ethan's steady presence reinforced that control, that measured authority, that clarity of mind that spoke more powerfully than any raised voice or dramatic display ever could, leaving Vanessa to confront the implications in silence, the room heavy with understanding. The apartment had grown quieter, the hum of the city outside softened by the evening air, and Ethan Brooks sat back in his chair, letting the tension of the last hour settle into something measured, almost tangible. Vanessa had moved to the far end of the couch, her phone now idle beside her, fingers resting lightly on her lap, eyes meeting his with a tentative curiosity that had not been there before. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, hands clasped loosely, and allowed the pause to stretch, giving weight to the unspoken. Every small gesture, every subtle glance, carried significance, and Ethan understood that in stillness, clarity often arrives. He spoke softly, deliberately, weaving together the narrative of months of observation without raising his voice, letting each fact and sequence unfold naturally, like pieces falling into place within a quiet mosaic. Vanessa shifted, the first sign of unease, her smile tighter, her posture subtly more rigid, and Ethan recognized that the framework of truth he had laid out was beginning to resonate. He moved through the details with care, the casual mentions of meetings and dinners with Daniel Price, the social media posts highlighting achievements and comparisons, the subtle boasts in private conversations that had once slipped past him. Each reference was contextualized, not as accusation, but as evidence of a pattern, a demonstration of behaviors she had assumed unnoticed, and he let the implications rest lightly in the air, allowing her to arrive at understanding without confrontation. Outside, the streetlights flickered against the wet asphalt, casting long, thin reflections across the windows, and inside, the apartment felt expansive yet intimate, a stage for this precise, controlled revelation. Ethan observed her reactions closely, the slight furrowing of her brow, the way her gaze flicked to the notebook on the table, the almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders. All of it confirmed the impact without a word having to carry anger or judgment. He allowed silence to punctuate the narrative, giving space for comprehension, letting the truth speak in the quiet, in the gaps between sentences, in the weight of deliberate observation. Vanessa leaned back slightly, her hands now folded, her attention fully on him, processing the clarity of the sequence, the inevitability of the conclusions she could no longer avoid. Ethan's own breathing remained steady, his posture calm, commanding without effort, embodying the controlled presence he had cultivated over years of discipline, observation, and restraint. He concluded the recounting not with flourish or drama, but with measured finality, letting the documented patterns, the collated evidence, and the meticulous preparation convey the message with precision. The room held its own quiet, as if acknowledging the completion of this phase, the transformation of observation into undeniable understanding. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, indifferent to the small revelations inside, while Ethan remained seated, patient, calm, and resolute, aware that the impact of truth was often greater when delivered without embellishment, when clarity itself carried the weight of authority, and in the reflection of the window, he saw not only himself, but the recognition in Vanessa's eyes that the landscape of their shared reality had shifted irreversibly. The room settled into an almost sacred quiet as Ethan Brooks leaned back slightly, letting the moments stretch between them, each second weighted with the unspoken recognition of what had been revealed and what remained for comprehension. Vanessa's gaze shifted slowly from the laptop screen to his eyes, trying to trace the invisible line between observation and understanding, her posture tense yet hesitant, as though testing the limits of what she could accept without immediate response. Ethan allowed her the space, knowing that the power of truth lies not in force but in the measured pause, in letting the narrative settle into awareness without interruption. He traced the edges of the table with a fingertip, a subtle metronome to his own thoughts, each movement a quiet declaration of presence, patience, and control. The apartment lights reflected softly off the polished surfaces, emphasizing the clarity of the moment, while the faint hum of the refrigerator and distant traffic outside became a rhythm to accompany the careful unfolding of his observations. He spoke again, softly, methodically, reviewing the chronology of actions, the patterns of attention and praise she had given to others over months, not in accusation, but in a calm, factual recitation that made it impossible for omission or misinterpretation to remain. Vanessa listened, subtle shifts of expression passing across her face as she absorbed the implications, a flicker of realization dimming the casual confidence she had carried throughout the evening. Ethan's tone remained even, his voice a constant undercurrent of controlled authority, demonstrating that mastery of a situation comes as much from observation as from action. He noted the interplay of small details, the positioning of messages, the timing of social interactions, the choices of emphasis she had made unconsciously. Each piece, individually unremarkable, collectively undeniable. He paused after a series of observations, letting silence give weight to the facts, allowing her the space to witness the framework he had constructed, to see clearly the breadth of understanding he had patiently assembled. Vanessa's hand twitched slightly over the edge of the couch, the only movement in an otherwise still tableau, and Ethan recognized it as acknowledgement without admission, comprehension without surrender. The evening light softened further as the city beyond their window dimmed with the onset of night, casting long, thin shadows across the floor and furniture, shadows that seemed to mirror the subtle tensions between them. Ethan remained steady, breathing controlled, posture unyielding yet relaxed, embodying the quiet vigilance that had guided him through the past hours, through the collection of details and the careful mapping of the narrative that had unfolded. He did not rush, did not over-explain, did not allow emotion to overshadow clarity, but rather let the accumulated understanding manifest in a measured presence, a calm that carried the certainty of knowledge. Vanessa's lips parted, a faint, hesitant exhale, and Ethan allowed the silence to hold, knowing that comprehension was more effective than interruption. Every detail of her previous boasts, every casual comparison, every subtle exaggeration now rested fully within his grasp, cataloged and contextualized. And in that shared quiet, the balance of awareness shifted imperceptibly, the apartment itself seeming to contract around the weight of clarity, leaving Vanessa to reconcile the sequence of truths she had revealed with the calm authority of the man observing, understanding, and poised, the truth no longer needing argument to exist, only recognition to resonate. Vanessa finally reached for her phone, not to scroll this time, but to hold it like a shield. Ethan noticed the movement and let it happen. People reach for familiar objects when the room stops feeling familiar. He had seen founders do it in investor meetings, tapping pens, checking watches, smoothing jackets, anything to feel in control while the ground shifted under them. Vanessa stared at the dark screen, then placed the phone face down on the couch cushion. "So what is this?" she asked, her voice careful now, stripped of the playful edge she had carried earlier. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. "This is me asking why you needed me to feel smaller every time his name came up." The words were quiet, but they changed the temperature of the room. Vanessa blinked, then gave a short laugh that did not reach her eyes. "You are making this dramatic." Ethan nodded once, slowly, like he had expected that sentence and had already placed it in the correct file. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I finally noticed the script." Her expression tightened. "What script?" Ethan opened the laptop again, not quickly, not with the flair of a man trying to win a scene, but with the patience of someone laying a document on a conference table. The screen lit up between them. He did not show her everything. Not yet. He opened one photo first. A charity luncheon downtown, Vanessa in a cream blazer, Daniel Price at her side, both smiling beneath a banner for a children's literacy nonprofit. The caption below it read, "Some men do not talk about ambition. They walk into every room wearing it." Ethan turned the laptop slightly. This was 3 weeks ago. Vanessa looked at the screen, then away. That was just a caption. Ethan clicked once. A group chat screenshot appeared, the one Rachel from her marketing circle had forwarded to him after feeling uncomfortable. Vanessa had written that Ethan was sweet, but Daniel had the kind of confidence that made people move faster. This was 2 days later, Ethan said. Vanessa's face lost another shade of certainty. "Rachel sent you that?" Ethan did not answer the question, because the sender was not the point. He clicked again. A calendar invite. Coffee with Daniel. 11:30 in the morning. A restaurant 40 minutes from her office, across town, nowhere near any meeting she had mentioned. Vanessa leaned forward now, her posture sharpening. "That was networking." Ethan gave a small nod. "I know. You wrote networking in the notes. You also told me that day you were eating lunch at your desk because your workload was impossible." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of doors closing. Vanessa opened her mouth, then stopped. Ethan watched her search for a clean path through the facts, the way people do when they realize the story they planned no longer matches the receipts. He did not enjoy it. That surprised him. For weeks, He had imagined that truth would feel like victory. Instead, it felt like standing in a house after a flood, seeing the waterline on the walls, knowing exactly how much damage had been there while everyone kept saying the place was fine. He took a breath and clicked to the final document, the partnership memo from the national retail chain, signed and dated, with his company name across the top. Vanessa stared at it, confused at first, then more focused as the meaning landed. Ethan spoke before she could ask. This goes public Friday morning. It is the largest contract my company has ever signed. It took 18 months, 6 failed pitches, 3 bridge loans, and more nights than I can count. I did not tell you yet because legal had an embargo. Vanessa's eyes lifted to his. Ethan held her gaze. While you were using Daniel as the picture of success, I was quietly building the thing you kept accusing me of not being able to build. Her fingers curled into the couch cushion. Ethan, I did not know. He gave the saddest smile of the night. That is the part one finally believe. Outside, a car passed through a puddle, the sound soft and brief against the window. Inside, the apartment felt still enough to hear the old version of their marriage fading. Ethan closed the laptop halfway. You did not know because you stopped looking at me. You looked at the idea of me you could criticize. You looked at the version that made Daniel seem taller. But you did not look at the man getting up at 5:30 every morning, keeping promises you never bothered to count. Vanessa's eyes glistened, not with theatrical collapse, but with the first quiet recognition of consequence. Ethan stood, calm as the night around him, and for the first time in months, he did not feel like he was asking permission to be respected. Vanessa sat back, her hands now folded tightly in her lap, and the apartment seemed to contract around the intensity of the moment. Ethan Brooks remained standing, the calm authority in his posture unshaken, as though the slow cadence of revelation had set the rhythm for the room itself. He allowed the silence to hang for a beat, letting the weight of all that had been shown settle fully, knowing that comprehension does not always arrive instantly but builds in layers, each observation adding to the last until recognition can no longer be ignored. Vanessa's eyes flicked to the notebook on the table, the one she had glimpsed briefly but never thought would matter, and now it was impossible to ignore. Every screenshot, every date, every small cross-reference confirmed the patterns he had traced for himself, the narrative of diligence, patience, and attention she had overlooked. Ethan spoke again, quietly, methodically, noting the alignment of actions and intentions, pointing out the subtle consistencies that formed the framework of understanding, and he did so without accusation, without raising his voice, because the facts alone carried the weight of authority. Vanessa shifted slightly, the first real hesitation in her posture, as she realized the depth of observation that had taken place over months without her awareness. She had thought small boasts, casual references, and selective comparisons were fleeting, inconsequential. Now she saw them collected, aligned, and presented not as judgment, but as undeniable clarity. The room was still except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft illumination of the streetlights outside, and Ethan allowed the natural quiet to emphasize the precision of his words and the certainty of the observations he had made. He guided her through the sequence, step by step, drawing attention to the times, the choices, and the moments she had assumed were invisible, letting the accumulation of evidence speak for itself. Vanessa's breathing shifted subtly, a silent acknowledgement that she was processing, that recognition had finally begun to take hold, and the space between them seemed to thrum with the quiet power of controlled understanding. Ethan remained calm, his presence steady, each word deliberate, each pause measured, embodying the patience, discipline, and insight that had allowed him to observe fully before revealing, and in doing so, to transform what could have been conflict into clarity. Outside, the evening deepened, city lights reflecting off wet streets from a passing drizzle, and inside, every detail of the apartment, the furniture, the soft ticking of the wall clock, the faint glow of the laptop, served as markers of this moment, framing the revelation with subtle authority. Vanessa's gaze remained fixed on him, no longer playful, no longer teasing, but open and searching, as she quietly reconciled her assumptions with the reality Ethan had calmly presented, the quiet recognition in her eyes confirming that the cumulative weight of observation, preparation, and truth had shifted the balance in a way that words alone could never have achieved. leaving the apartment filled with a palpable sense of understanding, patience, and the quiet assertion of control. The tension in the apartment eased just slightly, like the last notes of a song lingering after the music has stopped, and Ethan Brooks allowed himself a measured breath, noticing the subtle shifts in Vanessa's posture as she processed the weight of what had been revealed. The city outside was dark now, wet streets reflecting the glow of streetlights and passing cars, and the soft hum of traffic became a distant metronome to the quiet intensity inside. Vanessa's hands were folded, resting on her lap, fingertips brushing lightly against each other as she looked at him, eyes wide with comprehension that had taken hours to surface. The playful mask she had carried all evening now replaced by a tentative acknowledgement of the patience, observation, and careful orchestration that had brought them to this point. Ethan leaned slightly forward, resting one elbow on the table, and allowed a single long pause, giving weight to the cumulative evidence, the collected facts, and the carefully mapped narrative that now existed between them. He spoke softly, his voice steady and deliberate, recounting the final sequences, the alignment of events that she had inadvertently revealed, allowing her to connect the dots herself, the impact amplified by the calm authority he maintained. Every subtle glance, every careful phrasing, every minor gesture now carried significance, and Ethan relied on the stillness to emphasize the clarity of his observations, knowing that the revelation did not need embellishment, only recognition. Vanessa shifted, leaning slightly forward, the tension in her shoulders less defensive now, more contemplative, as she traced the pattern of her own actions laid bare through the patient precision of his methodical exposition. Ethan noted the slight flicker in her eyes, the quiet inhale that punctuated her realization, and he allowed it to fill the space between them, understanding that comprehension, when arrived at through careful observation rather than confrontation, has a weight that lingers far longer than any sharp words. He gestured minimally toward the documents, the laptop, the notebook filled with dates, screenshots, and notes, each artifact reinforcing the narrative without commentary, letting the accumulation speak for itself. Vanessa's lips parted, a breath caught in subtle astonishment, her hands releasing into her lap as though accepting the full impact of what she had unintentionally displayed. Ethan remained calm, his own posture relaxed but unyielding, embodying a controlled authority that came not from dominance, but from meticulous attention, restraint, and insight. The quiet stretched in the apartment, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city, and Ethan let it linger, allowing the weight of clarity to settle fully. Vanessa finally exhaled, a subtle movement of acknowledgement rather than surrender, her gaze softening with understanding as the sequence of events she had set in motion became undeniable in its pattern and implication. Ethan closed the laptop gently, letting the soft click mark the conclusion of the exposition, and leaned back just enough to convey the calm finality of someone who had watched, listened, and guided with care, leaving the apartment filled with a sense of resolution, patience, and the quiet power of truth observed and revealed, where recognition had replaced denial and understanding had taken root without force. The apartment had settled into a calm that felt almost tangible, the kind of quiet that comes when the air itself seems to respect the gravity of what is past. Ethan Brooks remained standing by the table, hands resting lightly on its surface, the soft glow from the city outside casting a gentle light across his features, highlighting the patience and careful attention that had carried him through the evening. Vanessa sat across from him, shoulders relaxed for the first time in hours, eyes fixed not on the laptop, not on her phone, but on him, absorbing the clarity of the narrative he had quietly constructed and revealed. The documents, the screenshots, the careful tracking of interactions had all done their work, demonstrating without accusation, illustrating without embellishment, and now the truth rested firmly in the shared space between them. Ethan exhaled slowly, letting the moment expand, understanding that the work of observation and measured revelation had reached its natural conclusion, that the patterns she had set in motion could no longer be denied or dismissed. Vanessa's fingers twitched lightly on the edge of the couch, a subtle motion of recognition rather than defiance, and Ethan noted it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned to let clarity speak louder than emotion. The city lights shimmered on wet pavement outside, casting elongated reflections through the blinds, echoing the stretches of time he had spent collecting, reviewing, and preparing, and he allowed himself a small, controlled smile, not of triumph, but of completion, of a task executed with patience and precision. He walked slowly toward the window, hands in his pockets, and looked out at the streets below, imagining the rhythm of life continuing, unaware of the quiet assertion of truth that had taken place above it. Vanessa shifted slightly, leaning back into the couch cushions, and spoke softly, a voice measured with new understanding. "I did not realize all of it." Ethan turned toward her, calm and steady, eyes meeting hers without judgment, only clarity, only the presence of a man who had witnessed, comprehended, and acted with deliberate care. "Now you see," he said quietly, "that patience and attention matter more than quick judgments, and that understanding requires listening, noticing, and waiting for the right time to speak." She nodded slowly, the first hints of genuine reflection showing in her expression, and the apartment seemed to breathe along with them. The quiet hum of the city blending with the soft ticking of the wall clock, marking time in harmony with the measured rhythm of comprehension and acceptance. Ethan moved back to the table, resting a hand on the open notebook, the collection of evidence now serving not as a weapon but as a testament to diligence, clarity, and the quiet power of observation transformed into revelation. Vanessa's eyes followed the gesture, and for the first time she met his gaze fully, without distraction, without deflection, and in that exchange, a subtle understanding passed between them, a recognition that the framework of reality had shifted in a way that words alone could not undo, leaving the room filled with the calm authority of truth observed, acknowledged, and respected. And Ethan felt the quiet satisfaction of having guided the evening to its natural resolution, the final chapter of an understanding built on patience, precision, and the disciplined application of attention to detail, with the acknowledgement of consequences, the clarity of insight, and the establishment of an unshakable foundation of comprehension between them.